You guys see that new Star Wars trailer? Oh boy, so many new props to build. Today, I'm gonna make the Inquisitor lightsaber. Here we go. For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, triangular bevel foam, coffee foam, putty, paint, super glue, silver rub and buff, wax metallic finish, PVC pipe cutter, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter, and some other stuff. Power converters, kyber crystals, that sort of thing. I'm gonna start with 1/2" EVA foam, then I trace and cut a foam circle, cut from a floor mat. This piece was conveniently already cut to the perfect diameter. I think it was an offcut from a droid build, like a center cut from an R2-D2. There's really no way to be sure. Built so many droids. Then I used a razor pen to cut a roughly 1" deep incision along the edge of the circle, about 1 millimeter or 2 below the depth of the pattern side, and all the way around its circumference. I'm going to be switching back and forth between metric and freedom units, by the way, just to confuse people. I honestly use both, depending on the circumstances. It can be difficult to get a clean cut through EVA foam, so I'm using a brand new blade for this project, and also 1/2" foam, just because it tends to cut a little more cleanly than the 3/8" foam that I normally use for armor, helmets, robots, etc., and is a little bit less flexible, because this is supposed to, in the end, give the appearance that it's made of metal. See, now I can cut that out a lot easier, and avoid a great deal of sanding. Then I used a slightly smaller circle to trace the interior circle. It's just a random piece of scrap styrofoam. And then I carefully cut out the center, making sure there wasn't too much variation in the width of the ring as I go. This is nearly impossible without a metal trace pattern, so when I'm finished, I'll need to clean it up a bit on my belt sander. I suppose you could also use a rotary tool. Yeah, that may have been easier. At any rate, I popped out the center, flipped it over, and peeled off the pattern from the back of the ring, which did reveal more surface that would need to be sanded. However, it's still far less sanding than if I had to remove the entire pattern. Seriously, this saves like half an hour. At least 15 minutes. See, the cleaner your cut, the less you're gonna have to sand. And less sanding means far less cleanup. Also less foam in my lungs. I mean, I got the masks, but how long does it hang in the air after you take the mask off? That's what I wanna know, you know? You gotta think about these things. I was originally gonna use a foam dowel for the hilt, just for consistency. I was sort of latched onto this idea of making the whole thing out of foam. But as I marked the placement, I realized that it was too flexible for this particular project. I mean, you could get away with it, but I'm gonna need to hollow out the center, but keeping it perfectly centered as I drill it out, it's just gonna be a nightmare. So instead I went with PVC pipe. See, I like to use foam because it's easy to work with and the prop is crash resistant, it's destructive resistant. It's not gonna be completely destroyed if it falls off a shelf. And something that's this size and level of detail, it's just fastest to make out of foam. If it was a really complex lightsaber with a lot of little grooves and things, then I might consider 3D printing. But then you gotta deal with that texture, which means more sanding. It's the whole thing. These are all the variables I'm thinking of before I choose a medium to work in. And it's worth consideration to think about these things before every product, just to cut down on your own frustration, you know? Next, I took a length of triangular bevel foam and attached it around the outside perimeter of the ring, being careful not to glue it to the small sections that the hilt would need to traverse, because that's just gonna be a waste of foam, and the bevel foam is surprisingly expensive. I mean, you can make it yourself with a triangular V cutter, but that can be a little bit less uniform as you go down the length of it. Also, mine broke. That too. Support me on Patreon so I can afford replacement tools. When the bevel was attached, I cut the edge down, exposing a 2mm base for the thin blade to sit on. It's just a slightly larger surface area for the glue to adhere to. Otherwise, you know, it's trying to sit on the top of a pyramid, you know? Is this making any sense? We can't all be David Attenborough. Seriously, I should get a speech coach. Again, I sanded away the imperfections. Next, I made the outer blades. They're not quite circular. I mean, some of them are. There are slight variations in the various Inquisitor lightsabers, but generally they all have this circular guard with blade/emitter tracks attached to the hilt. In order to do that, I laid the circle flat onto a sheet of 2mm foam and weighted it down with metal blocks. Then I traced it with a paint marker. That's not necessary for people trying this out at home. It just shows up a little bit better on camera, you know, otherwise I'd be showing black on black, you know, against the dark foam. I removed it and then free-handed the blades. Then I cut them out with the razor pen. After they were cut out, I super glued them to the ring very carefully because super glue was actually designed to bond to skin, so it has a tendency to want to stick itself to your skin a little bit more in the foam. And if you glue yourself to foam this thin, then you can easily tear it trying to get unstuck. Just fair warning. Once both the blades were attached, I moved on to the hilt. As I said before, the foam dowel flexed too much, so instead I used a length of PVC pipe. I cut that down a bit using my PVC cutter. Hacksaw will also work. Lots of materials will work, it's just this is specifically designed for this, so you know. Then I chopped the ring in half. Before attaching it to the hilt though, I'm gonna need to add some variable diameter sections using 4mm craft foam. I cut rectangular strips and made sure that the ends were cut at an angle in order to strengthen the seam. I cut a second one for the opposite end. They're both identical. Next, I heat formed the pieces using my heat gun. When it was sufficiently heated up, I rolled it up and stuck it into a cylinder to help shape the foam into a curved piece. When they cooled, I wrapped them around the PVC pipe and glued them in place with superglue. For the wider grip section, I cut a much wider piece of scrap foam and then repeated the same heat forming process as on the smaller ones. Heated it up, rolled it up, and stuck it in a pipe. When that cooled, I glued it onto the hilt. It didn't quite make it all the way around, so I added some shims. Then I made an oval-shaped stencil for the grip cutouts. I did this so that they'd both come out exactly the same in their proportions. I traced that onto the foam with a pencil, making sure that the flaw was at the center so that it would be essentially erased after I cut out the oval. Then I cut them both out. See, when I glued it on originally, I made sure that I only glued the edges at either end of this grip piece and made sure to keep the glue away from the grip openings so that once I cut the ovals, they would just pop right out. You don't want to have to try and cut through set glue. Now, because the ends of each section are supposed to be slanted and not flat, I added more triangular strips of foam bevels, which were actually scrap pieces left over from the Atomic Heart robot hair build, and wrapped them around the pipe at the edge of every single section. See, I'll save scrap material that will save me work in the future, you know? Like if it's a shape that would be expensive for me to go out and buy, you know? I haven't quite hit my patron goal yet. Just for that one that goes pretty much around the circumference of the ring blade, ring guard, I didn't have one quite that long, so I had to go with the store-bought one. Here though, caught a break. By the way, as I'm doing this, I'm making sure that all of the seams generally end up on the same side of the saber, so that in the event that I need to get a static, really close-up shot, all those seams that might not totally be erased by later build processes can easily be hidden simply by turning that side away from the camera. I mean, it's a machined object, I would expect there to be seams, but I'm not noticing a ton of lengthwise seams on the Inquisitor sabers, so I chose to build it. So that's what's influencing my decision making here. You know, every prop has a good side. I cut much more acutely angled triangles, triangular bevels, for either end. Then I sanded away the imperfections on my belt sander. Then I filled in the seams with fast dry putty. After the putty dried, I attached the ring blades one at a time, also a few pieces of scrap foam on the emitters. Finally, I painted it. Next, I gave it a base coat of gloss black. This took 3 layers of that gloss black base coat before I could do the metallic top coat. I have to do this because the foam acts like a sponge, absorbing the first couple layers of paint. This means it's going to take a really long time to paint, so if you're trying this out at home, you may want to consider Plastidip, although that can get expensive. When the paint was dry, I rub and buffed it up. I went over it with silver rub and buff. There are shinier silvers, but I'm out. I'll typically use Molotov chrome or autochrome when I want something to be really chrome. I put foam O-rings inside the hilt to hold in the tracking blades, and I cut it out using a leather hole punch, but any sharpened pipe that's the correct diameter will do. I just happened to find this in my leatherworking kit. I pressed the hole punch into the foam and worked it back and forth until I'd punched a hole in the middle. I saved the offcut for future projects. I repeated that step on the other side. Now for the blade, I found a dowel that would fit snugly into the saber, cut it to length, and I wrapped it with reflective safety tape. Because the adhesion on that tape isn't fantastic over a curved surface, I then wrapped it with clear packaging tape, which holds a lot better. I like to use the reflective tape for the blades, partially because that's how they originally shot it, but also also because under the right lighting conditions, it creates a really cool in-camera effect. Not to mention, you know, because I make videos, I'm usually putting in some kind of enhancement effects onto the blade in post, and it's easier to track the blade when it's moving around if it's as reflective as possible. But that's just a film industry thing, you know? And lastly, I bled a Kyber crystal. This I had to steal from a Jedi, but just so that you don't have to go through all that, they're also available in my Etsy store, link below. Shameless product placement. And there we go. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this build, then you can head on over to the Patreon page and join these fine people who make these videos possible. Seriously, that ad revenue is a joke. An enormous amount of work goes into these builds, and they just would not happen without the support of my patrons, who, by the way, receive ad-free early access while ensuring the channel's survival. Because these builds take so long, while I'm working on the next project, you can check out the numerous past builds by following the links, presumably on your screen, and subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified of future uploads. Alright, happy crafting. See you later.